Ashley Parker let out a sigh and reclined on the comfortable cushions of her living room sofa while listening to the gentle sounds of the day. It was one of those rare days when the outer world seemed to slow down, with a breeze coming in through the slightly open window. Down, leaving her in her comfortable suburban house alone with her thoughts. Painstakingly kept, a half-empty chamomile teacup was left on the side table's warmth has long since faded, much like the lively energy she previously experienced. Ashley radiated effortless elegance with her passion for the life she now led at 40. Her deep green eyes frequently bore a burden of reflection, and her hair fell in gentle waves beyond her shoulders. Showed more than she had planned to, even to herself, that life had been good in monetary terms, but less giving in her heart. She didn't have any kids of her own. However, she loved her 21-year-old godson, Ethan, who was more like a nephew to her. Ethan, the son of her deceased best friend, had spent many hours strengthening their familial bond. Spent the summers here, but as he got older and started college, their trips became less regular and more formal. But Ashley was by herself today, or so she believed. After spending the majority of Ashley chose to spend the morning cleaning the kitchen and going through a mountain of old photos. She sat down with a glass of wine in the comfortable embrace of her sofa, still wearing her favorite silk robe. As the afternoon's subdued light cast shadows across the room, her thoughts wandered aimlessly. The wine rich, she closed her eyes, relishing the moment as the velvety slipped down her neck. In the stillness, she failed to notice the faint sound of footsteps or the car driving into the driveway. Ashley was so engrossed in her own world that she didn't realize Ethan had returned early. After realizing he had forgotten his phone following a quick visit the day before, and Ethan was aware of her behavior. Instead of locking the entrance door, he thoughtlessly pushed it open in the hopes of finding his misplaced device and failed to notice the door's creak, which surprised her and broke the silence. Ashley suddenly sat up, her heart rushing into her as the needle dragged across the finish line. Hardly had time to straighten her robe when Ethan entered the living room, his abrupt arrival and completely unexpected. Aunt, he started speaking. Ashley's eyes froze as he faltered, taking in the scene before him. Locking with Ethan's as they both felt the pressure of the moment. She was intensely conscious of how the fabric of her robe clung to her body. Despite being covered, catching the light in a way that made her feel vulnerable. She experienced a surge of embarrassment as her cheeks turned deep crimson. Ethan's wide eyes showed how uncomfortable he was. She stammered as she spoke, trembling as she automatically tightened the rope around herself. "Why are you here?" Ethan looked away. "I left my phone behind," while he stroked the back of his neck awkwardly, his ears scorching red. "I didn't mean to," but he gestured hazily yesterday that he couldn't finish as he finished speaking. The air between them was heavy with unspoken. Ashley felt the heat grow in her chest, embarrassment rising, tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Added to the fact that she had completely let her guard down, her mind was racing, trying to think of something to say. "You should have knocked her to defuse the situation." Her tone was harsher than she had intended, and she instantly regretted what she had said. "I apologize," Ethan replied hastily, sounding more accusatory than she intended. Ashley sighed and ran a hand through her hair, saying, "Everest, I didn't think you, I didn't know." "Ashley. It's okay," she whispered through her hair as she attempted to gather her thoughts. Speech lacked confidence, "So please wait a moment." Ethan nodded and retreated a step closer. The doorway as though to give her room, but the discomfort was still evident, and Ashley, who could not be avoided, stood rearranging her robe and wiping away imaginary fuzz from the cloth as she approached the hallway. "I'll get your phone," she responded, trying to regain control with a harder voice. "Any kind of control." Ethan paused, then moved aside as he is on the kitchen counter, making tentative, uncertain movements. Murmured in a contrite tone, and Ashley vanished into the kitchen, appreciative. She drew a deep, stabilizing breath while leaning against the counter and holding on to the edge for the brief respite. She was grounded by the cool granite beneath her palms, yet the scene vividly replayed in her head. Clarity, she kept seeing Ethan's face, with its mix of astonishment, and there was another emotion on his face that she couldn't quite identify. She took out the phone, her fingers gliding over its glossy surface as she inhaled and steadied herself. went back to the living room and held the phone out to Ethan while forcing a smile. Simply her voice, "Thank you," Ethan responded in a low voice, without showing any signs of the internal struggle she was experiencing. He grabbed the phone from her, paused as though he was trying to find the proper words, and then said nothing more. Fingers momentarily touching during the conversation, the touch was brief, yet it left in sensation, a glimmer of something they both sensed but didn't entirely comprehend. Ashley led him to the door. She wanted the time to finish so he could go, so she could regain the silence, so she took slow, deliberate steps. Comfort of her afternoon, but Ethan hesitated before turning as he entered the porch. "I didn't mean to make things strange," he murmured, his eyes genuine, turning back to face her. "I'm so sorry," Ashley smiled a little, her heart softening in spite of herself. "Okay, Ethan, just knock the next time." He nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. Ashley shut the door behind him as he headed to his car, promising to kiss his lips. As she let out a big breath, he leaned against it, and the home felt different. The silence was no longer reassuring, but it was infused with an energy she couldn't quite identify, so she went back to the couch. With her wine unopened and her tea now cold, her mind was racing with ideas she couldn't. Ashley tried to dismiss the feeling that something had happened for the remainder of the afternoon. She convinced herself that the awkward moment between them was nothing. Will eventually fade, but she knew in her heart that she couldn't quickly forget how Ethan had gazed at her or how her heart had responded, and as Ashley, the room was covered in long shadows as the sun sank lower in the sky. The house was filled with an almost unnatural stillness that made one wonder what the days ahead would bring. Ashley Parker sat by herself at the mantelpiece, only to be distracted by the faint ticking of a clock. Her fingers were making absent-minded circles on the smooth wood of the dining table. Had been waiting there for what seemed like hours, even though Ethan had only left his phone a few minutes before. Held firmly in his hand, and she could still hear his footsteps on the porch, blending with the sound of her heart continued to gallop, despite her best efforts to control it. With an unrelenting thump in her chest, she gazed down at the table, her thoughts escalating into the picture of Ethan standing there in the midst of a frenzied turmoil and shame. She felt vulnerable as his face, which was a mixture of surprise and apologies, reproduced itself with a harsh clarity in the living room. She felt vulnerable in a manner she hadn't expected, and no amount of justification could make it go away. Considering the moment they had spent together, Ashley suddenly jumped up, pushing the chair back and making it scrape the floor. She had to get up and do something to break the oppressive feeling. She roamed aimlessly, her bare feet padding softly against the cool tiles, the stress clinging to her like a second skin. Her hands shaking, she went into the kitchen and grabbed the sink, turning on the tap and feeling the blast of cold water, giving her a tiny dose of grounding comfort and splattering it on her face, allowing the cold to bring her back to reality, if only the respite was brief, though. As she straightened up and she hardly recognized the lady staring back at her auburn when she noticed her reflection in the window over the sink. Her green eyes were wide and inquiring, and her hair was a little unkempt. Guilt, humiliation, or something more profound was the emotion she was unable to fully identify. The sound of a car engine revving in the driveway startled her out of something she wasn't prepared to face. Ashley froze as she listened, her breath stopping in her throat. She listened carefully to her pulse and the familiar creak of the front porch steps. Accelerated again and returned. This time, Ethan didn't knock. A moment after the door softly opened, he emerged in the kitchen doorway, his phone still in his hand. His face seemed uncertain, looking around the room with his black gaze before focusing on her for excruciating seconds. They were silent, the tension between them pulling tense. Finally, in a low, unsure voice, he murmured, "I forgot my charger." Ashley blinked, straining to discover her own voice. She was able to handle her sentences in the living room. Ethan nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a minute longer, his voice more like a question than a statement. Ashley let out a loud exhale before he turned and headed back toward the living room. She could hear movement in the other room as she struggled to stabilize herself, her hands grabbing the sink's edge. The mild creak of furniture and the subtle rustle of fabric throughout the room were excruciatingly ordinary, but they were imbued with an intensity that defied comprehension. Ethan halted again in the doorway when he handed back the charger. Ashley folded her arms across her chest in a state of unconsciousness as she turned to face him. Their eyes locked in a self-defense posture, and for a brief instant, everything appeared to I didn't mean to leave the two of them alone in the dark kitchen. Ethan broke the pause with an honest tone and cautious words, as if he were treading carefully to make things difficult. "You didn't, Ashley," on delicate ground. Her voice spoke too rapidly. Was strained, and she was aware that Ethan's shifting of weight from one foot to the other with his hands wasn't convincing. He acknowledged that he was fumbling with the charge and that I should have knocked, but his eyes fell to the ground without even Ashley agreed, stiffening her throat. "But it's okay, let's just." Even as she said it, the words felt hollow, and she made it clear that forgetting wasn't an option. Not when she could still see how his eyes had opened, because the recollection of the moment was so clear in her mind. The way he fumbled over his words while attempting to explain himself surprised me. And she could still feel her heart racing as though it were trying to get away from the heat that was rising in her cheeks. Ethan looked up, his black eyes finding hers again, and saw that there was something unsaid and disturbing that caused her to gasp. He whispered softly, "Catch, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Ashley spoke again, this time in a calmer tone, but it seemed like a lie. She seemed uneasy, but not in the way he had assumed, given their stillness. Ashley changed her weight since she was pregnant and carrying feelings that none of them dared to express. She wanted to say, her fingers clutching the counter's edge as though it were the only thing holding her grounded. Anything to relieve the tension in the air, but she couldn't think of anything. Ethan replied, "I should go," his voice finally breaking, thoughts a jumbled mess. The stillness, he moved to face the door but paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I apologize, Aunt." Ash felt uncomfortable using the nickname he had given her since he was a boy. Like a stark reminder of their shared boundaries, which they had always felt hazy and unsure now. "But it's okay," Ashley added. Ethan's voice was hardly more than a whisper, and he nodded before leaving. Ashley stood there for a while as the door closed behind him, leaving an almost deafening silence in its wake. Her hands were still on the counter as she gazed at the vacant doorway, her thoughts racing over all of the she attempted a second encounter with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. To reassure herself that it was just a moment of awkwardness and that they would both move on. Past, but she was more aware of the tension that had developed between them in her heart. Wasn't something that was readily disregarded, it was a tiny but unquestionably, there posed a risk of sparking something far more intricate than she was ready to confront Ashley when she shut out the kitchen light and withdrew to her own alone bedroom. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were just getting started. Something that she couldn't identify but couldn't ignore had changed between them, and as in the stillness of the night, she lay awake and gazed at the dim patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, wondering how long they could continue to act as though nothing had changed. Even when Ashley couldn't determine the exact time or manner of its occurrence, it was delicate, nearly undetectable, but days had gone by when she clung to the walls, filling the gaps between her and Ethan and languishing in the quiet. Their uncomfortable meeting, but the memory of it continued to haunt her. Despite her best efforts to ignore it, it kept recreating itself with ruthless precision. She tried to tell herself it was only a brief moment of embarrassment, but the tightness persisted. Being extremely conscious of everything, Ethan's footsteps appeared louder and more purposeful as he strolled through the home. Every word he spoke had a weight to it, and the way his voice carried couldn't overlook even the tiniest exchanges as they passed one another in the corridor, exchanging quick hellos, and there was an unsaid electricity in the kitchen that neither of them dared to express. Admit that Ashley felt the brunt of it most on a Sunday afternoon. She had long ago stopped reading, but she was still in the living room, snuggled up on the sofa, and holding a book in her lap. Her mind strayed, absorbed, and the words on the page blurred together as she read them. Thoughts prevented her from leaving the house, which was silent save for a little hum. Ethan was upstairs, and even though she hadn't heard the dishwasher in the kitchen or the rustle of leaves outside, seeing him throughout the morning, she was keenly conscious of his existence. The dim creak of Ashley tensed when the stairway disturbed the stillness and stunned her. As she heard his footsteps coming down, her fingers tightened on the book, but she pushed herself to relax and take as she took a deep breath and looked up as Ethan came into the room. "Hey," he greeted in a casual tone. There was a hint of hesitancy in Ashley's tone when she said, "Hey." Equally measured, she put the book down and sat up taller. "Did you get a good night's sleep?" "Yes, I suppose," he said, stroking his hair as he waited in the doorway for a while, seemed undecided about coming. After a little pause, he moved more slowly as he entered the room. Ashley watched him intently, her heart pounding more quickly in spite of herself. Detested how conscious she was of him and how his black gaze followed her around. His presence seems to occupy the room in a way that was both reassuring, and she moved slightly, crossing her legs in an unnerving attempt to appear calmed. "Do you want something to eat?" in a somewhat too bright voice. Ethan shook his head, a slight smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, a little too forced. "I'm good," thanks to his lips, and then there was an unpleasant pause that lasted between. Ashley saw that they were tense and delicate, like an invisible thread, ready to abruptly. She looked at the coffee table and seemed self-conscious of it. Felt like a tiny, obvious detail, a reminder of the empty wine glass she had neglected to bring to the kitchen. Given her previous displays of sensitivity, "I was considering going out for." Finally breaking the silence, Ethan added, "Maybe take a walk or something." Ashley remarked in a courteous, but aloof tone, "This sounds nice." She grabbed for the. Ethan hesitated as if she knew she wouldn't be able to concentrate, then she opened the book again, to the point she had left off. He waited for her to continue, but when she didn't, he nodded and looked at Ashley's chest began to relax a little as she watched him leave. The sound of footfall diminished throughout the corridor, but the respite was brief as it was replaced by a. Later that night, Ashley was plagued by a persistent feeling of dread. Discovered herself in the kitchen, making dinner with an almost compulsive level of precision. She cut veggies with thoughtful attention to detail, the steady sound of the knife hitting the cutting board, a tiny bit of solace in the otherwise. Ethan had just returned from his walk in Silent House, but he had remained to himself, and when Ashley heard him, she was thankful for the distance as she stirred a soup on the stove. She felt him approach, but she didn't look back, keeping her attention on the task at hand. His presence was. There is a noticeable warmth that seems to emanate from him, and the place smells nice. He broke the stillness with a "thank you," and Ashley answered in a harsh tone. With a firm hand, she grabbed for the salt and sprinkled it into the pot. It would be done in a few minutes, but Ethan didn't react right away, and when she eventually looked back, she saw him leaning his arms against the counter. Crossed as he observed her, there was a curious look in his eyes. "Perhaps even you've been quiet today," he remarked, adding something deeper that made her heart race. Ashley shrugged, returning his attention to the stove, yet his tone was light but questioning. When Ethan questioned, "Busy," she answered in a neutral tone, "Busy avoiding me." She felt sick to her stomach because of the taunting tone with which he spoke. Ashley attempted to compose herself and froze, her hand clenching around the spoon. Even though it sounded hollow to her ears, she managed to giggle. "Don't be absurd." Ethan pushed off the counter and moved closer, standing next to her. "I believe," he asked as Ashley turned to face him, her heart racing as she spoke in a softer, more solemn tone. Met his eyes and asked, "What are you talking about?" "You know what I mean," muttered, looking over her belongings with his dark eyes. "Been altered, and I believe you sense it as well." Ashley's breath drew her attention. Rushing while she searched for the appropriate words to convince him that he was dreaming, but the fact was there, looking her in the face, and there was no denying the tension between them. After days of establishing a subtle undercurrent, she finally stated, "I think you're reading too much into this." She went back to the stove in an attempt to cut the talk short, but Ethan's voice was unsteady. "Perhaps," he replied gently, "but perhaps I'm not." Ashley held on to the edge of the weight of his presence, and the passion in his voice made her knuckles white as she struggled to maintain her calm. Voice was excessive, she felt so vulnerable and exposed that she wanted to. With a sudden, louder than necessary voice, she exclaimed, "To hide, dinner's ready," and turned around. Ethan didn't bring up the matter, but when they sat down to eat, she hurriedly got off the burner and reached for the plates. The tension that had descended on the house was not going anywhere, and Ashley's stillness between them said volumes. knew that it would eventually come to a head because the evening was shrouded in a disquieting silence. Kind that made the home feel smaller and seemed to magnify every floorboard creak and wind whisper outside. Ashley's every stride felt heavy as the walls closed in around her. She had attempted to dismiss the discomfort that had sprung over her due to the stress of the previous few days. She kept thinking about those moments as if they were unsolved riddles, but tonight the tension was too great to ignore. Ashley was sitting on the edge of the sofa with her fingers, and the soothing glow of the living room lamp created long shadows on the walls. The book she had been feigning to read was lying on the coffee table, and she was nervously fiddling with the hem of her jumper. The table's pages opened to a chapter she couldn't remember, and she began thinking somewhere else, engrossed in the bits and pieces of dialogue and quick looks that Ethan was upstairs when it happened, and she knew this because she could, as he walked around his room, I could hear the slight murmur of his footfall. It served as a silent reminder that he was there. She had avoided him at all costs, because of his constant rhythm, which both reassured and unnerved her. Day looking for ways to pass the time, but now that the house has settled into it there was no getting away from the thoughts that tormented her at night, so Ashley let out a deep gasp and ran a hand across her hair while attempting to regain her composure, telling herself that she was reading too much into every situation. However, recalling the intensity in Ethan's eyes while he spoke and the way he had gazed at her in the kitchen was unforgettably, it had sparked a fire inside of her that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put out. She was distracted from her thoughts by the cracking sound of the steps. Ashley's her breath caught as she turned to face the doorway, her heart racing. Expectation. Ethan emerged a moment later, his body lit with his dark gaze. He hesitated as the soothing light spilled into the hallway, touching hers, and for a time, their quiet felt nearly. Ashley shook as he questioned in a quiet, almost hesitant voice, deafening, unable to sleep. She forced a tiny smile on her face, but it was just Ethan, who was restless, nodded and crept quietly farther into the room. He sat down on the other end, his presence filling the room with such assurance that Ashley's heart raced. Of the couch, maintaining a cautious distance between them, but even that felt too close. He questioned in a casual tone. Although there was a suggestion of something more in his remarks, Ashley shrugged as her fingers tightened around the hem of her jumper, or something like that, and they fell silent. Ashley could feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on her, which was both cozy and confining. She hesitated to look him in the eyes as he pressed down on her like a physical touch. Rather than concentrating on the candle's flickering light on the coffee table, Ethan stated abruptly, his voice breaking through Ashley's silence, "I've been avoiding you." She hastily added, "I haven't," as her head jumped up and her eyes met his in surprise. Ethan arched an eyebrow, quickly, a small smile teasing the edges of his lips. He spoke in a gentle yet firm tone, "And I believe we both understand why." I'm not sure what caused Ashley's cheeks to flush with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "You're talking about," she said defensively. "Yes, you do," he added, looking at her. "Regardless of what is going on between us, you sense it too, don't you?" A heavy, unsaid question hovered in the air, challenging her to face the reality she had been attempting to avoid. Ashley was struggling to find the appropriate words to reject it, and her breath seized her thoughts as they spiraled. Tell him he was dreaming, but the intensity of his voice and his appearance made it difficult for Ethan to say, "This isn't before she stopped talking. He asked in a calm tone, flinching, "This isn't something we should be talking about," yet firm. "It's real, Ashley, you know that." When he said her name, it made me shudder. Her back, and she detested how it made her feel exposed and vulnerable, and as she was unprepared for the sudden space she put between them. "This is ridiculous," she murmured in a trembling voice as she paced the length of the room. "You're overanalyzing, and so are we." Ethan stood as well. He said, "Am I?" as he closed the distance between them with measured motions. "I don't think I'm Ashley," so I'm speaking softly and turning to face him. Throbbing as she looked into his eyes, and she was both frightened and excited by the resolve in his eyes. Opened her lips to say something, but Ethan softly held out his hand before she could. A spark of electricity brushed across hers, sending a shockwave through the air. Ashley rose with all of her might, gasping for air as she gazed. She ought to have retreated from their grasp and stopped this before it got any worse, but she was held back by the weight of the situation and the growing feelings between them. Ashley, Ethan responded, "Tell me I'm wrong," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. She gazed up at him, looking for something with her eyes. "Tell me you don't feel it." Anything to ease the situation, but all she saw was genuineness and sincerity that rendered her helpless. "Ethan," she started speaking. "Shaky, this isn't right, but it feels right," he remarked in a soft voice, but persistent. Doesn't Ashley's determination falter the barriers she had constructed around? She wanted to deny it, but she was falling under the weight of his words. To push him away, but the reality was indisputable. It did feel somewhat right. That went against reason and logic. She closed her eyes, letting a single tear fall down her cheek. Ethan put his hand up to cup her cheek as she mumbled, "I don't know." "I do," he murmured softly as he brushed away the tear from his cheek, "and I believe you do, too." Additionally, the tension between them reached its breaking point at that same moment. The tightly guarded barriers between them vanished, leaving just unfiltered emotion and the unspoken bond that had been growing between them. Ethan leaned in, and Ashley's breath hitched. She had the opportunity to pull away as the movement slowed, but she chose not to, and everything altered. There was an odd stillness to the night that seemed to permeate every. The moon hung low in the corner of the house outside. Long, silvery shadows are formed on the lawn by the pale light of the sky. Was tense, a quiet storm rising that had been building for days. Ashley was sitting at the dining table with her fingertips lightly touching the rim of the tabletop. The room was faintly lit, and the warm glow of her unopened wine glass. She had attempted to avoid the gentle shadows cast on her face by the overhead chandelier. She tried to divert her attention with routine tasks like responding to emails and reading magazines, but her thoughts wouldn't stop. Every word, every glance, every minute of the previous week's events played repeatedly. She was struggling to control her emotions when she heard the faint creak of the stairs. Prior to seeing him, her heart began to race with a recognizable pounding that she had grown to fear, and if she was being truthful with herself, she expected to glance up as soon as Ethan entered the room, his presence imperious, even in his hands stuffed into his jeans pockets as he paused in the doorway. The moment's peaceful simplicity. There was something unusual about him tonight, an intensity, as his dark eyes scanned the room before landing on her. Quicken couldn't sleep, so she asked him in his eyes that made her pulse. Ethan shook his head and stepped, his voice firm, despite the turmoil inside her. Ashley said, "No," further into the room, "and I don't think you could." Despite his busy mind and strained smile, he nodded and pulled out a chair across from her. The large, sturdy table felt like a brittle wall, separating them as they sat down. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The stillness was so thick and uncompromising that it was nearly, "I had to say something because it's intolerable." Ethan eventually broke the silence. Ashley put her drink down and heard a solid, low voice that made her chest tense. Her fingers were quivering a little, but Ethan interrupted, "Please just let me." Ashley froze as his eyes met hers. "I can't hold this within any longer." As she watched him strain to find the correct words, she felt her breath catch in her throat. There was a vulnerability in his "I'm not sure when it began," but there was a rawness in his expression that made her heart hurt. Maybe it was that night in the kitchen, or perhaps it was much earlier, but his voice started out steady but with a hint of emotion. "I can no longer ignore Ashley's stomach, I just know that something changed." Ethan felt a wave of fear and an unidentified emotion flood over her. "You're not required to, but I do," he urged, leaning forward and holding the "I need you to understand how I feel," and the room seemed to be grounded by the edge of the table as if that were the only thing. As Ashley's thoughts raced, she longed to stop him from shrinking the walls that were crowding in. Turn away, but she was unable to do so, because she was anchored there, drawn in by his words, his stare, and his presence. He remarked, "I think about you all the time," his voice growing softer but not any less intense when he was with you. "As if nothing else matters, and I can't stop wishing I were Ashley's when I'm not." She was certain he could hear her heart thumping so loudly that her breath caught. She shook her head, her voice shaking as she at last mustered the courage to say, "Ethan, this isn't something we can do." He responded in a tone that was almost imploring, "Why must we continue to act as though nothing is here?" She said in a complex tone, her voice breaking, "Because it seems wrong." Ashley turned away from her hands as Ethan murmured, "You can't tell me you don't feel it too," his eyes searching hers. Clinging on her lap while she struggled to maintain her balance, the truth hung and she felt the link between the pole and the air, which she couldn't deny. Unfathomable connection that had developed between them, but admitting it was risky, and she wasn't. "I don't know." She muttered, almost inaudible, "I'm ready to fall." Ethan stood as he knelt next to her, his presence overwhelming as he walked around the table, the chair scraping the floor. "You know," he muttered, soft L, and reached for her hand. Thus, his gentle, firm touch grounded her for a little moment that seemed to, it may break at any moment. Ashley's eyes were watering from the weight of her. She glanced down at him, her breath catching as her emotions threatened to crush her. "This isn't fair," she replied in a voice that caught his gaze. "I'm trembling, but it's not about fair," Ethan stated in a soft voice. Dedicated to what's true, Ashley closed her eyes, allowing a single tear to fall down her cheek as she attempted to maintain the barricades and walls she had erected around herself. She didn't know how to stop it, and the well-manicured areas were falling apart. "You don't have to, Ethan." She acknowledged that her voice was breaking. The room fell silent again as he tightened his hand over hers and murmured, "We'll figure it out together." Ashley's thoughts were spinning with the weight of his words hovering over them. Feelings, her heart hurting from the unattainable option she had to trust in their relationship and believe him, but the fear of as they sat there, the night dragged on, and she was held back by what lay ahead. Burdened by the unfulfilled promises and unresolved issues between them, and Ashley couldn't help but question whether she had gone too far and would never be able to get back from the morning light. Streamed softly and diffusedly through the drapes, illuminating the space with shades of gold and shadow, causing Ashley to stir in her. Her eyes fluttered open as she woke up to the soft buzz of the outer world. She briefly felt as though she was trapped in that delicate place, imprisoned in time, between consciousness and sleep, but suddenly the relentless weight of reality struck in. And she sat up slowly as the previous night's events came flooding back with a clarity that made her heart race. The silence of the house was oppressive, and every sound was amplified as she pressed her palms to her face and breathed unevenly. The subtle rustle of leaves, the faint creak of the floors, and the silence. Ashley let her hands drop to her lap as everyone outside appeared to echo the chaos inside of her. Her eyes strayed to the window, where the sun was shining brightly, steadily upward, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her head. Repeated every single word, every glance, and Ethan's voice remained unadulterated and genuine. His confession, his touch, and the vulnerability in his gaze stayed in her ears, were ingrained in her mind, making it impossible for her to escape the emotional maze she experienced. Guilt, bewilderment, longing, and everyone's desire for domination are all dragging her in. Ashley swung her legs over the side of the bed in a new way, bringing her bare feet together. Unsteadily, she rose, wrapped her arms around herself and walked to the cool hardwood floor. She hardly recognized the reflection of herself in the bathroom mirror over the sink. Her auburn hair was she sprayed cold water on her face in the hopes that it would help her emerald eyes, which were rimmed with shadows from a sleepless night. The weight resting against her chest would be removed by it, but the relief was her eyes briefly landed on the chair near the window where her sweater hung as she returned to the bedroom. When Ethan knelt next to her, he brushed against the same sweatshirt she had worn the night before. The memory made her. She shook her head, as though the act could dispel the ideas that threatened to overwhelm her, and her pulse quickened. Ashley's heart stopped when she heard the faint clink of dishes downstairs. She skipped a beat upon realizing that Ethan was not by himself, and the weight of his presence was even from a distance, and she could feel the excitement twisting in her stomach. And dread. She inhaled deeply to regain her composure before heading out. The sunshine streaming down the stairs illuminated the kitchen, emphasizing that Ethan stood behind the counter, his back to her, in the simplicity of the room. He was wearing a casual outfit and made careful movements while pouring a cup of coffee. His brown hair was a little messy, as if he had also been absorbed in his thoughts during the night. Ashley hesitated when she saw him because he was both familiar and different. she finally said, doorway morning, in a softer tone than she had intended, Ethan. For a brief while, his dark eyes met hers, and they were silent, the pause between them like a delicate thread, after which he gave a tentative little smile. Ashley entered the room carefully in the morning, moving as if she were negotiating a minefield, and she grabbed for a mug, her hands shaking a little as she filled it with coffee. Everything that they weren't saying was charged into the dense air between them. "How are you?" Ashley looked at Ethan, her lips curling into a smile, and he asked, "Sleep?" Ethan nodded, his look contemplative. "Yeah, me." A slight forced smile wasn't very good. For a while, none of them spoke, the only sound she heard was Ashley's spoon clinking against the mug. She felt his eyes on her, but she averted them, concentrating instead on the swirl of cream melting into her coffee. She felt her chest tighten from the intensity of his presence, and I meant what I said. Ashley's hand halted in the middle of stirring her when Ethan murmured something abruptly last night in a steady but gentle voice. She gazed up at him, gasping for air, her green eyes looking for answers. "I realize it's hard, but I wasn't prepared to hear Ethan." He kept moving closer. "Even while I understand that you're afraid, I still believe Ashley set her up." Mud down, her hands shaking as she positioned herself against the counter, with her eyes closed and her thoughts racing. "Searched for the appropriate words, but we are unable to at last," she replied, hardly raising her voice above a whisper. "Just pretend it didn't happen." Ethan's tone was forceful, "But I'm not acting that way, and I don't believe you are either." Ashley looked up at him, her heart racing as she looked into his eyes. "Do you understand what you're saying?" "I know it's not," he responded simply when I asked. "Reasonable, but I am also aware that his words lingered in the air, weighty and uncompromising, and Ashley wondered whether they were true. Her will faltered, she wanted to tell him he was mistaken, but the pole that had been erecting between them for days was there, staring her in the face. Unquestionably, she acknowledged in a shaking voice, "I don't know how to do this." Ethan, unsure of where to begin, extended his hand and lightly brushed across her. Contact gave her a shock and reminded her of the feelings she had attempted to "We'll figure it out," he continued, so hard to suppress. Ashley stared down at their hands as they cuddled, her breath catching as she resisted the emotional tempest that was roiling inside of her and wanted to withdraw to the protection of denial, but she was unable to do so since their bond was too powerful and genuine to ignore. "Hurry," she murmured at last, her voice hardly audible, "we must exercise caution." "Ernest, I understand, and I'll follow your guidance no matter what." Ethan nodded. "You need me, I'm here." His voice was sincere, and his eyes showed unflinching support. Ashley's chest hurt, so she inhaled deeply and clenched her fingers around the "We'll chat later," she said, trying to steady herself on the edge of the counter. Her tone became stronger, and Ethan answered, "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need." Ashley nodded, her eyes falling on her as he said softly, "I'm not going anywhere." The tension in the room had somewhat subsided as she struggled to gather herself. But the significance of their discussion remained, serving as a silent reminder of the decisions they still needed to. Ashley stood by herself with the sun shining through the window as Ethan left the room. She took a drink of her coffee as the window cast long shadows across the floor. As she gazed out at the world outside the glass, she felt a sense of warmth and grounding. Understand what was ahead, but one thing was for sure, everything had changed. There was no way to go back.